It was a rainy day in Brooklyn, New York, the kind of day where the sky was a dull gray and the streets were soaked with drizzle. In the heart of Greenwood Cemetery, the quiet and peaceful resting place of many, a man stood alone by a gravestone, his black coat soaked through by the steady rain. David Whitman, a millionaire real estate mogul in his late 50s, had come to visit the grave of the only woman he had ever truly loved. Every year on the same day, October 12th, David brought a bouquet of white lilies to honor Elena, woman who had once been his light, his balance, before vanishing from his life without a trace. Today was no different, yet as David stood there, something unexpected was about to change. Everything he thought he knew. David wasn't just a wealthy businessman, known across New York City for his luxurious skyscrapers and high-profile deals. Behind his sharp suits and powerful image, there was a man haunted by regret. Elena had been the only person who made his life feel full, the one person who pulled him out of his world of numbers, contracts, and negotiations to remind him of the simple beauty in life. But years ago, she had disappeared, leaving David with unanswered questions and a void he could never fill. 5 years ago, he finally found her, buried here in Greenwood Cemetery. He had been too late. No explanation, no goodbye, just her name, etched in stone. Every year since, he visited her grave, hoping for some kind of closure. As David knelt before Elena's grave, placing the lilies gently on the wet grass, he whispered, "It's been 5 years, Elena, and I still don't understand why you left." His fingers traced the cold stone, the ache in his chest, as fresh as the day he learned she was gone. He closed his eyes, letting memories of her laughter and the warmth of her presence flood back. But then something caught his attention, a movement in the distance. David opened his eyes to see a young man standing just a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. The man couldn't have been more than in his early 20s, his dark hair curling slightly at the edges. There was a sadness in his eyes, an intensity that David couldn't quite place. He didn't recognize the young man, but something about the way he stood there, staring at Eleanor's grave, felt deeply personal. David stood slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto the stranger. "Did you know her?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The young man hesitated, his expression a mix of pain and hesitation. He shifted slightly, as if weighing his next words. And then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "She was my mother." David's heart stopped. For a moment, the world around him, the rain, the trees, the cemetery, all blurred together into a haze. He stared at the young man, his mind racing, trying to comprehend the words that had just been spoken. "What did you say?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. The young man took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto David's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Elena Whitman was my mother," he repeated. And then, with a voice full of both pain and accusation, he added, "If what she told me is true, then you're my father." David felt the ground shift beneath him, as if the earth itself had cracked open. The words hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away everything he had believed for so many years. Elena had been gone for so long, but now, standing in front of him, was a son he never knew existed, a son Elena had kept from him all these years. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing with 1,000 questions, but only one managed to escape his lips, trembling and raw. "Why? Why didn't she tell me?" The young man, his son, gave a bitter smile, one that seemed to hold the weight of years of unanswered pain. "I guess that's something you'll have to figure out," he said, his voice sharp with resentment, and without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the misty rain, leaving David standing alone, more lost and shaken than he had ever been in his entire life. For the first time in years, David felt powerless. His entire life had been about control, controlling his business, his image, his empire. But now, in the quiet rain of the cemetery, he realized just how little control he had over the things that truly mattered. He had a son he never knew existed, a son who had just walked out of his life before he even had the chance to understand what had happened. David looked around frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't let this end here. He needed to find him. He needed answers. Racing toward the cemetery's entrance, his eyes scanned the streets for any sign of the young man. But the rain and the evening shadows made it hard to see. And then, just as he was about to give up hope, he spotted a lone figure walking down the main road, shoulders hunched against the cold. Without thinking, David called out, his voice breaking through the silence. "Wait!" The young man stopped, but didn't turn around. David's pulse quickened as he closed the distance between them. "Please," he said, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please don't walk away. I need to understand." The young man slowly turned to face him, his dark eyes still filled with that same unreadable intensity. Up close, David could see it, the faint resemblance, the sharpness of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. This was his son. There was no doubt, but would he ever get the chance to know him? And just like that, the rain fell harder, the night closing in around them, as father and son stood on the brink of a moment that would change both of their lives forever. This was only the beginning. David stood there, his eyes fixed on the young man in front of him. The rain continued to fall, but neither of them seemed to care. A million thoughts raced through David's mind, but none of them made sense. He felt like a stranger in his own life, and the silence between them was unbearable. "I don't even know your name," David finally said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. The young man's face tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might walk away again. But then he let out a sigh and muttered, "My name's Ethan." "Ethan," David repeated, as if saying it out loud would somehow make this all feel real. He had a son who had grown up without him, a son he had never known. The weight of that realization hit him hard. "Ethan, I had no idea," David said, his voice raw with emotion. "I swear I didn't know. If I had..." Ethan cut him off, his tone sharp. "If you had known what, you would have been there. You would have stepped in and saved the day." "I doubt it." There was anger in his words, but underneath, David could hear something else. Pain, abandonment, betrayal. David opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the right words. How could he? How could he explain something he didn't even understand? Himself? He wanted to reach out, to say something that would make everything better, but he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know what she told you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't leave her. She left me. One day she was just gone. I spent years looking for her. I never found her until..." He paused, the words catching in his throat, until it was too late. Ethan's face softened for a moment, as if something David said struck a chord, but then the hardness returned. "She didn't talk about you much," Ethan said, "but when she did, it was clear that she didn't want you to find us." David's heart sank. "Why?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Why would she keep this from me? From us?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know," he said bitterly. "Maybe she thought you wouldn't care. Maybe she thought you were too focused on your money, your empire. Or maybe she just didn't want anything to do with you anymore. The accusation stung, but David couldn't deny the truth in it. He had been so consumed by his work, by building his fortune, that he had lost sight of what really mattered. But he had loved Elena. He still did. And the thought that she had kept this secret from him, it tore him apart. "I didn't know," David repeated, his voice cracking. "I would have been there, Ethan. I would have tried." Ethan stared at him for a long time, as if searching for some sign of sincerity, some proof that David wasn't just another rich man trying to clean up his mess. Finally, he spoke. "It's too late for that," he said quietly. "She's gone, and you missed your chance." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had missed so much. Ethan's childhood, his first steps, his first words. He had missed everything. And now it seemed like he might lose his son before he even had a chance to know him. But David wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "I know it's too late for the past," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But it doesn't have to be too late for the future. I don't want to lose you, Ethan. I want to know you. Please, just give me a chance." Ethan looked away, his jaw clenched. For a moment, David thought he was going to walk away again. But then Ethan spoke, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted. "You weren't there when I needed you the most. You didn't even know I existed." David felt the full weight of Ethan's words, the depth of the pain he had caused, without even realizing it. But he wasn't going to walk away from this. Not again. "I know I can't make up for lost time," David said. "But I want to try. I want to be here for you now. Let me prove that I'm not the man you think I am." Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between the anger he felt and the part of him that wanted to believe his father's words. "It's not that simple," he said. "You don't just get to show up after all these years and expect everything to be fine." "I don't expect that," David replied quickly. "I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." There was a long pause, the tension between them almost unbearable. Finally, Ethan let out a long breath. "I don't know," he said. Maybe I need some time to think." David nodded, understanding that he couldn't push any further. "Take all the time you need," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning and walking away, leaving David standing there in the rain, watching him disappear into the distance. As David stood alone in the cemetery, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him. He had spent so many years building an empire, amassing wealth, and yet, standing here now, none of that seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered was the chance to connect with his son, a son he had never known, a son who had grown up without him. But as the rain continued to fall, David knew this was far from over. Ethan's wounds ran deep, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much pain and anger to work through. And as David left the cemetery, one thought consumed him. How would he ever earn his son's trust? The tension was far from resolved, but one thing was certain. David wasn't going to give up. Not this time. He had lost Elena, but he wasn't going to lose Ethan. Not without a fight. David couldn't sleep that night. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Ethan, the anger and hurt in his son's eyes. He lay awake, thinking about all the years that had slipped through his fingers, all the moments he would never get back. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't give up. Ethan was all he had left now, and David would do whatever it took to earn his trust, to build the relationship they both deserved. The next few days passed in a blur. David tried to reach out to Ethan, sending messages, calling, hoping for a response. But Ethan was silent, and David felt the weight of that silence grow heavier with each passing day. He couldn't blame Ethan for needing time. After all, this was a shock for both of them. But David couldn't shake the fear that Ethan might decide to cut him out of his life for good. Just as David was beginning to lose hope, his phone rang. It was Ethan. David answered, his heart pounding. "Ethan," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though inside he was a bundle of nerves. "I thought about what you said," Ethan began, his tone cautious. "About wanting to be a part of my life." David held his breath, waiting for the words that would come next. "I'm not saying I forgive you," Ethan continued, "and I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think I'm willing to give it a shot." David felt a rush of relief and gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Ethan," he said softly. "That's all I'm asking for, a chance." They agreed to meet, this time over dinner at a small, quiet restaurant, far from the crowds and the noise of David's usual world. It was awkward at first, both of them unsure of what to say, but as the evening wore on, the tension began to ease. Ethan started to open up, sharing bits and pieces of his life, his struggles, his dreams, the person he had become, despite the absence of a father. David listened, truly listened, for the first time in a long time. He realized how much he had missed out on, not just in Ethan's life, but in his own as well. He had spent so many years chasing success, believing that money and power were the keys to happiness, only to find that they were empty without the people he loved. He had been so blind to what really mattered. And now, sitting across from his son, he was determined not to make that mistake again. As the conversation deepened, Ethan spoke about his mother, Elena. There were moments of silence, moments where the grief was still too raw for either of them to find the words. But they shared something now, a bond that went beyond the past. David learned about Elena's life after she left, the reasons she had kept her distance. It wasn't that she didn't love him, Ethan explained. It was that she had been afraid that David's world would swallow them up, that Ethan would lose his chance to grow up in a simpler, more grounded life. David felt a mix of sadness and understanding. He wished Elena had trusted him enough to stay, to let them face the challenges together, but he couldn't change the past. All he could do now was focus on the future, on making sure that he didn't lose Ethan the way he had lost Eleanor. The biggest turning point came when Ethan invited David to his college graduation, a milestone that David had never expected to witness. As he watched Ethan walk across the stage, pride swelling in his chest, David realized just how much had changed. For the first time in his life, he felt truly connected to something bigger than himself. This was his son, his flesh and blood, and nothing else mattered more than that. After the ceremony, as they stood together, Ethan handed David a folded piece of paper. David looked at him, puzzled, before opening it. Inside was a simple drawing, a sketch of a gravestone with two figures standing beside it, one large, one small, both facing the same direction. It was a drawing of them, standing together at Elena's grave. "I found it in some of her old things," Ethan explained quietly. "I think she always hoped we'd find each other someday." David's throat tightened, and he blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I wish she were here," he whispered. "I wish she could see this." Ethan nodded, and for the first time, he reached out and gave his father a hug. It wasn't a long hug, or even a particularly emotional one, but it was enough. It was a start. They stood there, father and son, the sun setting in the distance. David knew that life wouldn't always be easy, that there were still challenges ahead, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had Ethan, and that was all the family he needed. In the end, the money, the success, the power, none of it compared to this. David had spent so long building an empire, only to discover that the greatest wealth of all was standing right in front of him in the form of his son. And now, with Ethan by his side, he was ready to face whatever the future had in store. The story might have begun with loss and regret, but it ended with hope. David had found something far more valuable than he ever expected. He had found his son, and that was the true beginning of his new life.